All right. So my name is obviously Caelan Sullivan. I'm the first presentation for today. I promise you it's not because I'm brave, it's because I do not want to be super sweaty by the end of this. And so this summer I was working with my three mentors, Jonathan Henn and Allison Post, who thank you for both showing up, as well as Adam Mahood. And my project was called From Seasons to Regions, Unraveling the Productivity and Moisture Variation or Fuel Moisture Variations of C3 and C4 species. All right. So I spend most of my time working in and around grasslands, and grasslands have been shown to be a very beneficial or play very beneficial roles in many ecological networks due to their very unique biodiversity. So it would be great if we could keep them around and understand them to the best of our ability. And I was really looking at them in relation to wildfires. So when we think about wildfires, we often think of them in terms of forest fires, but data has shown that 64% of burned areas are in fact grasslands, whereas only 27 to 28% are forested areas. And so when we think about what goes into a wildfire, it's things like weather, topography, and fuels. And what I was looking at was the fuels. And in terms of C3 versus C4 species, I'm going to be referring to, or that's in reference to their photosynthetic pathway. So C3 you can think of as your more classically practiced photosynthetic pathway, and those species will be more sensitive to drought and intense direct sunlight, and they tend to be a little bit smaller. So an earlier cool growing period is a lot better for them, whereas your C4 species are going to be more productive and efficient in their use of limited water. So that curbs some of the seasonal restrictions and will allow them to grow a little bit larger. So my question this summer was, how does the productivity and fuel moisture of C3 and C4 dominated communities differ, and does that vary through time and space? So here is kind of an idea of what we expected C3 and C4 species to look like throughout the season. So on your x-axis here, you have the seasons, spring, summer, and fall, and your y-axis is the fuel moisture. We expect to see C3 species pop up earlier in the season and dry out by mid to late summer. And C4 species are going to pop up a little bit later and probably have a higher fuel moisture percentage. And then also just noting that there's a meeting point somewhere along those lines, and keep that in mind, but don't worry about it right now. I will get into that. So I was pulling data from two main projects, one of which was the 2023 Flammability Project, which consisted of 120 plots located around Boulder, Colorado. And then the other was the 2024 Fuel Moisture Project, which was working in the Central Plains Experimental Range, as well as the restored grassland west of Alt, Colorado. And the collection process was very similar for both of these. You would take your fresh biomass and you would weigh it before, putting it in the oven, cooking it to remove all that moisture, and then weigh it again after. And that is how you get that percent moisture, which I'm going to refer to a number of times. So that's really just the difference before and after cooking it. So that's how much water is in the plants. And the major difference between these two projects was for the 2023, samples were an amalgamation of these plots, which you can see pictured there, which were collected all together. And those plots were differentiated by the top three prominent species, whereas with the fuel project, the biomass was bagged individually by species. So you would identify one species and bag it separately from all the others. So this first graph is going to be for the flammability, and it's looking at how does fuel moisture differ between C3 and C4 grassland species or grassland plants. So on that x-axis, we again have the collection season between summer and fall, and the y-axis is our fuel moisture. And in this first one, we're only looking at the functional group of C3 species. And so you can tell that there's definitely a difference between summer and fall, which does make sense, of course, because during the summer is when plants are growing, so they're going to be taking up more water, whereas around fall time, they start to dry out and go into dormancy. And then here we're looking at a comparison of the two functional groups within a season. So the difference between C3 and C4 species within summer and fall. And it's important to note here that when I'm referring to C3 and C4 dominant, that is based on those, the flammability plots again. And dominance is based off of whether the species coverage is greater than 50% C3 or greater than 50%, which defines it as either C3 or C4 dominant. So it is not species specific. It is again that kind of generalized amalgamation. And you don't see much of a relationship within each season between C3 in the summer and C3 and C4 in the fall. They look very similar. This graph is kind of the realistic final product of that little one that I showed you before. So it doesn't look quite as pretty, but it actually does follow very similar trends to what we did expect. So this is a comparison of the percent moisture of C3 and C4 species for every sample date that was done. And this is going to be the species specific one. So C3 and C4 plants did tend to follow general trend. So you see a C3 species popping up in May and June and drying out between June and July, whereas your C4 starts to show up in June and July. And of course, there are always going to be exceptions when it comes to plants, which is why you see two spikes earlier in the season around spring. And that is when it's raining the most, so it kind of makes sense that some species are just going to pop up then. But there's a definite significant relationship here. And there again is that convergent point on the graphs. And it is important to note this one because this could kind of explain why the significance in the previous box and whisker plot was not that significant, because the samples that we were taking were going to be in this month of July and then also into August. And if you look at this graph, you can see that their fuel moisture is very similar, even though they are moving in opposite directions. That conjunction just makes it so they are going to look very similar. So what does this all mean? Essentially, it's telling us that there's not a significant variability in the moisture content of C3 and C4 species to say that their growth habit is notably dissimilar when compared. And that is with reference to the comparison regarding their potential flammability and the speculated role that that might play in wildfire behavior. However, like I said, the 50% plots regarding those are pretty generalized. So we had wondered if maybe we had done a greater than 75% species coverage, it might have given us a more in-depth analysis of the species, because it's very possible that those plots looked more like 45% C3 and 55% C4. So that is more or less 50-50, but we're only marking it as dominant by 1, which could skew the data in the end. But my hope is that this will be a foundation for further exploration and give us a broader view of the seasonal growth patterns of many species and what effect they might have on influencing wildfires. And that is all I've got. And that is a dung beetle that I saw at the Central Plains, and he rolls his little ball of poop, and it's very cute.
Well done. Questions for Caelan?
Yeah.
You said it was grasslands, but is it like BLM? Is it private land? What kind of land like that way?
Some of them were private land. Many of them, as far as I know, were owned by the city and County of Boulder. But that was for the flammability lab, and then for the fuel moisture, that was mostly the Central Plains. And then the other one was the restored grassland, which was also actually private land owned by Fort Collins.
The questions? Yeah, in the back.
More of a comment. I just really loved your presentation and you did a wonderful job putting it together. I just want to say that I really appreciate this type of study, because as we deal with fire in Colorado and the changing climate, these sorts of studies are going to be even more valuable as we assess how our grasslands are going to respond. So,
Absolutely, yeah. Especially if there's so many fires going on right now.
Yes, yeah, very relevant.
did you have a list of like the plant species that you took samples of?
Yeah, that is how we actually kind of distinguish between the C3 and C4, is that we had a species list of all the main species that we were taking, and then we would categorize them as C3 or C4.
What was the variety? Were there just like, 3 or 4, like, in 10s or 20s?
For the flammability, there was, I believe, around 20 or more. And then for the fuel moisture, we had maybe 7 for the C4 species and about 5 or 6 for the C3. Yeah.
You don't see changing moisture with altitude.
So all of our, we were not really comparing it to altitude, so I do not actually.
Thank you so much.